Hello, and thank you very much for tuning into this talk. I want to begin by reading about another event from Jesus' earthly life from Mark's Gospel account. So, Mark chapter 4, verses 35 to 41. On that day, when evening had come, he said to them, "Let us go across to the other side." And leaving the crowds, they took him with them in the boat, just as he was. And other boats were with him. And a great windstorm arose, and the waves were breaking into the boat, so that the boat was already filling. But he was in the stern, asleep on the cushion. And they woke him and said to him, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" And he awoke and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Peace, be still." And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. He said to them, "Why are you so afraid? Have you still no faith?" And they were filled with great fear and said to one another, "Who then is this, that even the wind and the seas obey him?" In these few moments together, I'd love to ask the question, God, do you even care? Now, for those of you listening who aren't sure whether there is a God, then can I encourage you to ask this question? If the Jesus we've been looking at this past week, if the Jesus we see in the passage I've just read for us is God, then does he even care? And in fact, this is the very question that the disciples ask in the story. Verse 38, "Do you not care that we are perishing?" It's a similarly prominent question for all of us to ask after the year we've just had, isn't it? 2020, we've all been affected in noticeable and often painful ways. As we look at our world and our news feeds, it's so easy to feel consumed by the bleakness of it all. Now, maybe some of you think that by adding God into the mix, into this question of suffering, it actually causes more problems than it solves. Now, I can't promise that I can deal with every question you might have on the topic, nor would I want to give you a cheap answer to such a pertinent question. But what I do want to suggest to you today is the very fact that there is a God is what allows us to deal with this question. I want to suggest to you that if the world just happened randomly by the Big Bang, then the chaos that is our lives has no real meaning. We actually have no real reason to ask the why question of suffering. And for me, that is both a very dissatisfying answer and not an answer that I think makes sense of our experience. Now, maybe some of you are open to the idea of God, but if he does exist, then surely he can't be in control of the world. If there is a God, then he's rather like the Jesus was at the beginning of the story, asleep with his head on the cushion. Or God is like a football groundsman. He's marked out the white lines on the pitch. He's put up the goalposts, but now he watches the game from the stands, not supporting either team and with no real interest with the outcome on the pitch. Now, before we come back to that question I asked at the start, I want to ask the question, God, are you even in control? Because there's not much hope in having a God who cares for you if he doesn't really have much of a handle on the world. And in fact, I don't think he'd be much of a God if he had no degree of control over these things. And so I want to take a closer look at this story with you and see what the God of the Bible is really like. Now, we arrive in this part of Mark's account with Jesus setting out to cross the sea after a busy day of teaching. And Mark, concerned with recording the event accurately, he's really detailed in his accounts. He takes note not just of the boat that Jesus is in, but the other boats that were with them too. And after they leave the crowds, this great windstorm arises. I wonder if you can picture it with me. They set off on the journey after a long, crueling day. Jesus wearily lays down his head at the stern of the boat, and the disciples begin to row to the other side of the sea. There they are, these experienced sailors. They're taking in the imposing surroundings of the nearby Mount Hermon, towering over them at 9,000 feet. They're cracking their favorite sea jokes, and then all of a sudden this great windstorm arises on them. The boat starts to get battered and tossed and turned by the power of the wind. The wind is pumping the waves up and over into the boat, crashing down onto the deck. And the boat starts to fill with water more and more. As the wind got more ferocious, the water levels rose, and these disciples were terrified. This was no cruise ship with plenty of time to solve the problem. No, as every second passed, death was staring these men in the face. And yet, where was Jesus? Well, Jesus remained in the stern, asleep on the cushion. Now, you might consider yourself a heavy sleeper, but surely nobody could sleep through this, could they? Well, the disciples, in great fear, they rush to Jesus and awake him and ask him, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" And Jesus rises and rebukes the wind and says to the sea, "Peace, be still." And as quickly as the storm arose, it was brought to an eerie silence. A friend once told me of a funny story of a kid, after hearing this story, heading straight down to the beach and becoming increasingly frustrated that he couldn't manage to stop the waves. And any weather person will tell you that even if the storm so happened to subside at that very moment, the waves would take hours before they came to a complete calm. Now, you might be thinking that here we go, we've entered the realm of ridiculous. The laws of nature serve to prove that no man could physically do this. And on that, I want to agree with you in part, for surely this cannot be the work of a mere man. And in fact, that is to the response of the disciples as we read on. Verse 41, and they were terrified and asked each other, "Who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him." Notice the disciples are absolutely terrified when they ask this question. The storm is over, and yet they are absolutely terrified. Now, one consensus point among the ancient cultures was that the sea was a symbol of unstoppable destruction and uncontrollable by any power but God. And so this is understandably terrifying, for here is a man able to exercise the power that only God has. He didn't call on a higher authority or make a wish to a genie. No, he instructed the storm, and like an obedient dog to his owner, it obeyed. This man, Jesus, is demonstrating that he is God and everything is subservient to him. Now, I think this has massive implications for you and myself. For if Jesus can control the things most powerful in this world by his very words, then I think it demands that we listen to him. This also takes us back to the question I asked at the start. God, do you even care? For if Jesus had control over the winds and the waves, then we need to ask the question, why did he allow the disciples to go through that incredibly traumatic experience? You know, if Jesus is really in control of the world today, why hasn't everyone received a COVID vaccine at his very words? Well, I think one thing we need to say is it's not because he can't do anything about it. But I also want to suggest to you that it's also not because he doesn't care. Look back with me to Jesus' response to the disciples. Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith? Notice Jesus doesn't come harshly to the disciples in the way he rebukes the wind and the waves, but he tenderly asks them, why don't you trust me? Jesus' question is suggesting that the disciples, and maybe our own premise, is wrong. Jesus is saying that he does allow people he loves to go through storms, but that wonderfully they do not need to panic because he is trustworthy. Now, I'm aware that this is an idea that's really difficult to grasp, and one I admit that I don't find particularly easy to get my head around. But ultimately, I think Jesus has shown he does care in the storms. And ultimately, that truth is found in the fact that he himself entered the ultimate storm. Jesus entered this world of pain and darkness, and he suffered the penalty of death, which our sin deserved, so that we would never have to suffer a storm that would have ultimate consequences. Now, that doesn't mean we would never face storms in this life. It does mean that one day Jesus would come and say, peace, be still, to all the storms that you and I face one day forever. And so I want to close by asking you the question that Jesus asked in this passage. Where is your faith? That is, in the storms of life, what is it that you depend on for your happiness, your security, your identity? And I want to encourage you, as you think about those things, to ask the question, are they as dependable as Jesus? For in one way or another, I think all of these things ultimately fail us because they're ultimately subject to the storms of life. And all of these things, they don't help us deal with the ultimate storm of death. And they don't help us with our deepest sin problem that we looked at last time. But wonderfully, in Jesus, we are shown that there really is a God who is in control, a God who really does care about us, and a God who offers us lasting peace, no matter how bad the storms get outside.